The grizzly stood 11 feet away, close enough that Clara Winslow could hear the low rumble building in its chest. She had no rifle, no spray, no stick to raise between herself and 800 pounds of muscle and claw. Her boots were sunk into wet moss, and behind her, the trail dropped into a ravine she would never reach in time. The bear's small eyes locked onto hers, and for 3 full seconds, nothing in the forest moved. Not the wind, not the birds, not Clara. Then the animal did something no one who studies bears would expect. It lowered its head, exhaled a long breath through its nose, and turned away. It walked back into the brush as though it had simply lost interest, as though the woman standing in its path was not food, not rival, not threat at all. Clara did not run. She did not even step backward until the sound of the bear's weight crashing through the undergrowth had faded into silence. Only then did her knees finally give a small tremble, and she let out the breath she had been holding since the moment their eyes met. This was not the first time. It would not be the last. Clara Winslow was 29 years old, and to anyone who met her in town, she looked like an ordinary woman. She had light brown hair she kept tied back in a simple braid, quiet gray eyes, and a way of speaking so calm it almost seemed rehearsed. She worked for the Silver Pine Wilderness Reserve, a stretch of untamed forest and mountain in the northern reaches of the province, where grizzly bears, wolves, and mountain lions still ruled the land the way they had for thousands of years. Clara's job, officially, was to monitor wildlife populations, track migration patterns, and help maintain trail safety for visitors. Unofficially, she had become something of a local legend, though she never spoke of it herself. The stories always started the same way. Someone would see her walking alone into the deep timber, carrying nothing but a notebook, a canteen, and a small camera slung around her neck. No weapon, no bear spray clipped to her belt like every other ranger carried. No radio, half the time, because she said the static disturbed her concentration. And yet, every single time she returned from those long walks, she came back unharmed, unshaken, and often with stories that made the older rangers go quiet and glance at each other, with expressions somewhere between disbelief and unease. Henry Doyle, the reserve's longtime supervisor, had worked in Silver Pine for over 20 years. He had seen hunters mauled. He had seen careless campers chased up trees. He had buried a colleague who made one wrong move near a mother bear with cubs. He knew, better than anyone, how quickly the wilderness could turn violent, how little warning it gave before it did. And still, when Clara Winslow walked into his office on her first week at the reserve and told him she preferred to work without a firearm, he had laughed, assuming she was joking. She was not joking. And within a month, Henry stopped laughing altogether. The first time he witnessed it himself, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. It was late spring, and Clara had gone out to check a series of motion-triggered cameras near a ridge known for frequent mountain lion sightings. Henry had gone along that day only because a group of tourists had reported strange scratching marks on a cabin door the night before, and he wanted a second set of eyes on the scene. They were crouched near one of the cameras, brushing leaves away from the lens, when Henry heard a sound that made every hair on his arms stand up. A low, guttural growl coming from somewhere in the rocks above them. He froze. His hand went instinctively toward the sidearm on his hip, but Clara did not move at all. She simply lifted her head, slow and deliberate, the way someone might glance up at a passing cloud, and looked directly toward the sound. A mountain lion emerged from behind a boulder no more than 30 feet away. Henry had encountered lions before, and he knew the signs of an animal preparing to charge. Ears flattened, body low, tail flicking. This lion showed every single one of those signs, its muscles coiled and ready, its golden eyes fixed on the 2 humans below it. Henry's mouth went dry. He began, very slowly, to reach for the radio clipped to his vest. Clara reached out and placed a hand on his arm, not with panic, but with something closer to reassurance. She did not raise her voice. She did not step backward. She simply stood, turned her body slightly sideways in a way that seemed almost deliberate, though she never explained why, and waited. The lion held its position for nearly a full minute. Henry would later say it was the longest minute of his life. Then, slowly, the animal's posture began to change. Its ears came up. Its tail stopped flicking. It lowered itself onto its haunches, watching Clara the way a dog might watch its owner, deciding whether or not to throw a ball, and then, without any warning at all, it turned and disappeared back into the rocks. Henry did not speak for several minutes afterward. When he finally found his voice, all he could manage to ask was how she knew the lion would not attack. Clara only shrugged and said she did not know for certain. She said she never knew for certain. She said she simply did not let herself believe that it would. That answer did not satisfy Henry. Not then, and not for a long time afterward. He had seen fear paralyze grown men holding loaded rifles. He had seen confidence get careless campers killed. Clara's calm was not the calm of someone who did not understand danger. It was something else entirely, something that seemed to come from a place deeper than training or experience. And the more he watched her work, the more convinced he became that there was a story behind it, one she had never told anyone at the reserve. Word of these encounters began to spread through the small town of Ashwood Hollow. The settlement nestled at the edge of the reserve where most of the rangers, guides, and researchers made their homes. At first, people assumed the stories were exaggerated, the kind of tall tales that grow taller with every retelling around a campfire. A woman who walked among grizzlies and lions without so much as a scratch sounded like folklore, not fact. But as the sightings accumulated, as more people witnessed these encounters firsthand, the skepticism slowly gave way to something closer to awe, and in some cases, quiet fear of a different kind. Not fear of Clara herself, but fear of what it might mean that predators reacted to her the way they did. A hiking guide named Grace Sutton, who led weekend groups through the lower trails of Silverpine, remembered the first time she heard Clara's name mentioned by an old trapper who had lived near the reserve for over 40 years. The trapper, a weathered man named Edward Lowry, had spent his entire life reading the signs of the forest, understanding the moods of the animals that lived within it. He told Grace that in all his years, he had only met one other person who moved through the wilderness the way Clara did, someone he had known decades earlier, and that person, he said, had vanished into the mountains one winter and never come back. He would not say more than that, only that Clara reminded him of things he preferred not to remember. Grace found the comment strange at the time, but she did not think much of it until she witnessed something herself, several months later, that she would never fully be able to explain. It happened during a routine patrol along the eastern boundary of the reserve, in a section of dense pine forest where wolf activity had increased over the previous winter. Clara had been assigned to survey a den site that had been spotted from a distance, to confirm whether it was still active before the reserve issued any trail closures for the season. Grace had asked to come along, partly out of curiosity about the rumors she had heard, and partly because she genuinely enjoyed Clara's quiet company on long walks. They had been walking for nearly 2 hours when the forest around them went unnervingly silent. Grace noticed it before she understood what it meant. The birdsong stopped, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush disappeared. Even the wind, which had been steady all morning, seemed to still. She felt a tightness form in her chest, an old instinct from childhood stories about wolves in the woods, and she glanced over at Clara, expecting to see the same unease reflected on her face. Instead, Clara had stopped walking and was simply standing still, her eyes scanning the tree line, with an expression of calm attention, the way someone might look for a familiar face in a crowded room. And then, from the shadows between the trees, they came. Not one wolf, but 5, moving with the fluid, silent grace that made wolves so difficult to see coming until they were already close. Grace would later describe the fear she felt in that moment as something almost physical, a weight pressing down on her chest that made it hard to breathe. She wanted to run. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, but something about Clara's stillness beside her made her hesitate, and in that hesitation, she watched the entire encounter unfold in a way she still struggled to put into words years later. The wolves did not circle them the way predators are trained to circle prey. They approached, slowed, and then simply stopped, forming a loose half-circle around Clara at a respectful distance, watching her with an attentiveness that felt less like a hunting party and more like an audience waiting for something to happen. Clara said nothing. She made no sudden movements. She simply lowered herself slowly into a crouch, bringing her eyes closer to the level of the largest wolf, a gray and black male that appeared to be the leader of the pack, and held perfectly still. For nearly 2 full minutes, Nothing happened. Grace stood frozen behind her, unable to look away, unable to speak, watching a scene that felt like it belonged in a dream rather than in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon patrol. And then, one by one, the wolves began to relax. Their tails, which had been held high and stiff, dropped into a more neutral position. The lead wolf let out a soft huffing sound, almost like a sigh, and turned to walk back into the trees, the rest of the pack following behind him in single file, disappearing as silently as they had arrived. When Grace finally found her voice again, all she could ask was how Clara had known what to do. Clara's answer, much like the one she had given Henry Doyle months earlier, offered little in the way of explanation. She said only that she had learned, a long time ago, that fear has a scent, and that predators can smell it before a person even realizes they are afraid. She said she had learned how to keep that scent from ever forming in the first place. It was not the kind of answer that satisfied curiosity. If anything, it only deepened the mystery surrounding her. Because fear is not something most people can simply choose not to feel, especially not when facing down a pack of wild wolves in the middle of dense forest with no weapon in hand. And yet somehow, for Clara Winslow, that seemed to be exactly what she had learned to do, and no one at Silverpine, not Henry, not Grace, not even the old trapper Edward Lowry, understood how, or why, or what price she might have paid to learn it. As the months went on, the reserve staff began to notice a pattern that went beyond simple luck or coincidence. Clara was never harmed. She was never even threatened in the way that ordinary encounters with wild predators tend to escalate. It was as though every dangerous animal she crossed paths with recognized something in her immediately, something that made them pause, reconsider, and ultimately choose to walk away rather than attack. Some of the older rangers began to joke that the animals of Silverpine had declared Clara one of their own, though the joke always carried an undertone of genuine unease, because none of them could offer a better explanation. What none of them yet realized was that Clara's story was only beginning to reveal itself, and that the true reason behind her strange and unshakable calm reached back further than any of them could have guessed, into a part of her past she had spent years trying not to think about at all. Daniel Marsh had guided hunting and photography groups through the Silverpine backcountry for nearly 15 years, and in all that time, he had never once seen anything that made him doubt the natural order of the forest. Predators hunted, prey ran, fear kept people alive, and confidence, more often than not, got them killed. That was the rule he taught every client who signed up for one of his trips, and it was a rule he believed without question until the afternoon a lost hiker's life depended on Clara Winslow, standing between him and a cornered black bear with nowhere left to run. It began as a simple search and rescue call. A hiker named Oliver Bennett, a visitor from the coast who had underestimated both the terrain and the distance of the Eastern Loop Trail, had wandered off the marked path chasing a photograph of a waterfall and lost track of the hours slipping by. By the time the reserve realized he was missing, the sun had already begun sinking behind the ridge, and the temperature was dropping fast. Daniel had been called in because he knew the Eastern Loop better than almost anyone, and Clara had volunteered to join the search because she was already on shift, and because, as she put it plainly, an extra set of eyes never hurt in failing light. They found Oliver just before full dark, huddled at the base of a rock outcrop with a twisted ankle and a face pale with exhaustion and fear. He was relieved to see them, babbling apologies and thanks in the same breath, and for a moment it seemed like the rescue would end there, simple and uneventful, the kind of story that gets told once at dinner and then forgotten. But as Daniel knelt to check Oliver's ankle and Clara scanned the surrounding rocks with her flashlight, she went suddenly and completely still, the same stillness Grace Sutton had described months earlier, the kind that seemed to announce danger louder than any shout could have. Daniel followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. Not more than 20 feet away, wedged into a narrow gap between two boulders, was a black bear, young but already large, its side pressed against the rock in a way that told Daniel immediately something was wrong. The animal was cornered. It had likely wandered into the gap chasing some small prey or simply exploring, and found itself trapped by the narrowing rock walls just as three humans and their flashlights arrived at the mouth of its only exit. A cornered bear, Daniel knew, was far more dangerous than a bear with an open path to retreat. Cornered animals do not think about escaping. They think only about surviving whatever threat stands between them and freedom, and that meant they think about attacking first. He reached for the bear spray on his belt immediately, his hands already shaking with adrenaline, but Clara's voice cut through the darkness before he could raise it, low and steady, telling him not to spray. Spray in a confined space like that, she said, would panic the animal further, and might blind all three of them at once in the process, leaving them defenseless in the dark, with an enraged bear only feet away. Daniel wanted to argue. Every instinct in his body told him to argue. But something in Clara's voice, the same flat calm he had heard about in every story circulating through Ashwood Hollow, made him hesitate long enough for her to move. She stepped between Daniel and the bear, angling her body the same way she had with the mountain lion months earlier, sideways, non-confrontational, small. She lowered her flashlight so it no longer shone directly into the animal's eyes. She began to speak, not loudly, not commanding, but in a low, even murmur that Daniel could barely make out from where he knelt beside Oliver, whose breathing had gone shallow and quick with terror. The bear's ears, which had been pinned flat against its skull, twitched at the sound of her voice. Its head turned toward her, nostrils flaring as it tried to read the scent carried on the cold night air. For nearly a full minute, nothing changed. The bear remained wedged in the gap, its breath coming in short, huffing bursts, its weight shifting from side to side in the universal signal of an animal, deciding whether to charge. Daniel had seen that shifting motion before, on a different trip years earlier, moments before a bear had charged a member of his group and left him with injuries that ended his hiking days for good. He braced himself, ready to throw his body between the animal and the two people behind him, certain that this encounter was about to end the same way. But Clara did not stop talking. She did not raise her voice, did not flinch, did not so much as glance away from the bear's eyes, even as it huffed and swayed, only a few feet from her outstretched hand. And slowly, impossibly, the shifting stopped. The bear's weight settled back onto all four paws. Its ears came forward, no longer pinned flat but raised in something closer to uncertainty than aggression. It let out one final huff, long and low, almost resigned, and then it began to move, not toward Clara, but past her, squeezing along the narrow gap between the boulders and out into the open forest beyond, disappearing into the darkness without ever making contact with any of them. Daniel did not move for several seconds after the bear had gone. When he finally exhaled, it came out as something close to a laugh, disbelieving and shaky, the kind of sound a person makes when their body is trying to process an event their mind has not yet accepted as real. Oliver, still on the ground with his injured ankle, simply stared up at Clara with wide, stunned eyes, repeating the word "how" under his breath, as though it were the only word he had left. Clara helped Daniel splint Oliver's ankle and guide him back down the trail to the waiting rescue vehicle, and throughout the entire walk, she said almost nothing about what had just happened. Daniel, unable to let it go, pressed her with questions the entire way. He asked what she had said to the bear, whether it was some kind of trick she had learned, whether there was a technique she could teach other guides, so that no one else would ever have to feel the way he had felt in those long, terrifying seconds. Clara's answers remained frustratingly simple. She said she had not been speaking to the bear at all. Not really. She said the words did not matter. What mattered, she said, was that her voice carried no fear in it, because the moment fear entered her voice, the bear would hear it and respond to it the way any predator responds to weakness. Daniel found himself unable to shake the encounter for weeks afterward. He had spent 15 years building a career on understanding animal behavior, on reading the subtle signs that separated a safe encounter from a dangerous one, and yet everything he thought he understood about predators seemed to bend and reshape itself around Clara Winslow, in ways he could not explain through any training he had ever received. He began asking around Ashwood Hollow, quietly, carefully, trying to piece together more of her story, and what he found only deepened his fascination. He learned that Clara had arrived at Silverpine nearly 3 years earlier, with almost no formal credentials, no university degree in wildlife biology, no prior employment with any other reserve or park service. Henry Doyle had hired her anyway, on nothing more than an instinct that told him she understood something about the wilderness that could not be taught in a classroom. He learned that she lived alone in a small cabin near the reserve's northern boundary, that she rarely socialized beyond her closest colleagues, and that she never spoke about her life before Silverpine, deflecting every question with the same practiced ease she used to calm frightened predators in the dark. He learned, too, from Edward Lowry, the old trapper who had first mentioned her to Grace Sutton months earlier, that there had been another person once, decades ago, who moved through these same mountains with the same unnatural calm, the same strange power to turn aside creatures that should have torn a person apart without hesitation. Edward would not give a name. He would not say what had happened to that person, only that the mountains had a way of shaping certain people into something the rest of the world no longer had a word for, and that he suspected, though he could not prove it, that Clara Winslow had been shaped the very same way. Daniel did not know what to make of any of it, and for a long time, he told no one about his growing suspicion that Clara's calm was not simply a skill she had chosen to learn, but something forged out of an experience far more difficult than anyone at Silverpine yet understood. He began watching her more closely after that night, not out of suspicion, but out of a genuine desire to understand, and what he began to notice, in the weeks and months that followed, only confirmed that her story was far from finished. It was Daniel who first suggested, almost offhandedly during a conversation with Henry Doyle, that someone should study Clara properly, not as a curiosity or a piece of local folklore, but as a genuine subject of scientific interest, someone whose apparent ability to influence the behavior of some of the most dangerous predators in the region deserved real research rather than campfire speculation. Henry agreed, though neither of them expected how quickly that conversation would set the next chapter of Clara's story into motion, or how many more encounters would surface once someone finally started asking the right questions and looking in the right places for answers. Dr. Nora Fitzgerald arrived at Silverpine Wilderness Reserve on a cold morning in early autumn, carrying 2 suitcases, a laptop full of behavioral data spreadsheets, and a healthy dose of professional skepticism. She had spent the better part of her career studying predator behavior across 3 continents, publishing papers on wolf pack dynamics and grisly territorial patterns that were required reading in university courses across the country. She had heard stories like Clara's before, exaggerated tales of fearless rangers and animal whisperers that always fell apart under careful scrutiny, and she fully expected this assignment to end the same way, with a tidy explanation involving scent masking or simple luck stretched thin across too many retellings. Henry Doyle met her at the small airstrip outside Ashwood Hollow and drove her the rest of the way to the reserve in near silence, offering only the barest outline of what she was about to witness. He had learned, over the past several months, that trying to explain Clara Winslow in words never quite worked. People needed to see it for themselves before they believed it, and even then, some of them spent weeks afterward trying to convince themselves it had not really happened the way they remembered. Nora's first meeting with Clara was almost disappointingly ordinary. Clara greeted her with a polite handshake, offered her tea in the small ranger station kitchen, and answered every question about her background with the same vague, unhurried responses that had frustrated Daniel Marsh and every other curious colleague before her. Nora, used to interviewing subjects who either overstated their abilities or grew defensive under questioning, found Clara's calm indifference oddly disarming. There was no bravado in her, no eagerness to impress, no hint that she considered herself special in any way. If anything, she seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention, answering questions briefly before steering the conversation back toward reserve business, migration counts, trail conditions, anything that was not about herself. It was not until nearly 2 weeks into her fieldwork that Nora witnessed anything that began to shift her skepticism into something closer to genuine scientific curiosity. The 2 women had been assigned to track a female grizzly known throughout the reserve simply as Number 14, a bear fitted with a research collar the previous spring, after she had begun venturing unusually close to the boundary trails with 2 cubs in tow. Protective mother bears were, by far, the most dangerous animals in Silverpine, far more likely to attack without warning than any solitary predator, and Nora had insisted on maintaining strict protocol distance throughout the tracking exercise, using long-range optics rather than approaching on foot. Clara had agreed to the protocol without complaint, and for the first several days of tracking, everything proceeded exactly as expected. They followed the collar's signal from a respectful distance, recorded feeding patterns and movement data, and returned each evening to the ranger station without incident. Nora began to relax, began to suspect that perhaps the stories about Clara had simply grown in the retelling, the way local legends always do, until the 5th day of tracking, when a sudden shift in wind carried their scent directly toward number 14's position, before either of them realized what had happened. The bear emerged from a stand of dense willow with startling speed, closing the distance between herself and the 2 researchers, far faster than either of them had time to process. Her 2 cubs scrambling up a nearby tree at her warning huff, while she planted herself between the intruders and her offspring, rising onto her hind legs to a height that made her seem, for one terrifying moment, almost twice her actual size. Nora had trained for this exact scenario more times than she could count, had taught workshops on proper response to bear encounters, had written papers analyzing successful and unsuccessful defensive strategies in exhaustive detail. And in the moment it actually happened, all of that training seemed to evaporate from her mind entirely, replaced by a pure, animal panic that rooted her feet to the ground and made her heart slam against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her throat. Clara, once again, did not run. She stepped slightly in front of Nora, not blocking her path exactly, but positioning herself as the more visible presence, and slowly, deliberately, she lowered herself toward the ground, not into a crouch this time, but almost prone, making herself as small and as unthreatening as a human body could possibly appear. She kept her eyes lowered, not avoiding the bear entirely, but never meeting its gaze directly either, and she began that same low, murmuring cadence Daniel Marsh had described from the encounter with the cornered black bear months earlier. Number 14 remained on her hind legs for what felt to Nora like an eternity, but was, according to the timestamp on the research equipment she reviewed later that night, closer to 11 seconds. 11 seconds in which 800 pounds of protective maternal fury hovered directly above 2 unarmed women in an open meadow. And then, gradually, the bear dropped back onto all 4 paws, huffed twice in rapid succession, a clear vocal warning, and began backing away, herding her cubs down from the tree and retreating into the willow thicket without ever closing the remaining distance. Nora did not speak for nearly 20 minutes after they had put a mile of trail between themselves and the encounter site. When she finally found her voice, her questions came out in a rapid, almost desperate stream, demanding to know exactly what Clara had done differently, what specific posture, what specific sound, what variable in her behavior had produced a result so drastically different from what every piece of published research suggested should have happened. Clara's answer, as it had been with everyone else who asked, offered frustratingly little in the way of concrete explanation. She said only that she had learned to read the difference between a bluff charge and a true attack long ago, and that number 14's posture, subtle as it was, had told her which one this was going to be, before the bear herself had fully decided. That distinction fascinated Nora more than almost anything else Clara had said. It suggested not a magical immunity to danger, but an extraordinarily refined ability to read animal behavior, a skill so advanced it bordered on instinct rather than analysis, the kind of pattern recognition that took most researchers decades of careful study to develop even partially, and that Clara seemed to possess as naturally as breathing. Over the following weeks, Nora began cataloging every encounter she could verify through witness accounts, cross-referencing dates, locations, and species, involved in an effort to find some unifying pattern beneath the seemingly miraculous outcomes. She interviewed Henry Doyle about the mountain lion encounter. She interviewed Grace Sutton about the wolf pack. She interviewed Daniel Marsh, and even tracked down Oliver Bennett, the rescued hiker, now safely back on the coast, still visibly shaken months later by what he had witnessed in the dark that night. A pattern did begin to emerge, though not the kind Nora had expected. It was not that Clara possessed some special scent or chemical signature that predators found non-threatening, a theory she had initially considered likely. Blood and hair samples, taken with Clara's reluctant permission, showed nothing unusual under laboratory analysis. It was not that she carried some object or substance that repelled animals, since she carried nothing at all beyond her notebook and canteen during every documented encounter. Instead, what Nora began to suspect, and what she found herself increasingly unable to dismiss despite every instinct of scientific caution telling her to remain skeptical, was that Clara's advantage lay entirely within herself, in a level of physiological and psychological control over her own fear response that Nora had never encountered in any human subject in over 15 years of field research. She began monitoring Clara's vital signs during a series of carefully controlled, low-risk encounters. Using a portable heart rate monitor, Clara agreed to wear during routine fieldwork. The results, when Nora finally compiled them, left her staring at the data for the better part of an evening, unable to quite believe what she was seeing. During an encounter with a young male cougar that crossed within 30 feet of their position while checking wildlife cameras, an encounter that sent Nora's own heart rate spiking to over 140 beats per minute, Clara's heart rate rose only slightly above her resting baseline, settling back to normal within seconds of the animal's departure, far faster than should have been physiologically possible for a genuine adrenaline response. This was not simple bravery, Nora realized. Bravery was a choice made in spite of fear, a conscious overriding of the body's natural panic response through willpower and training. What she was observing in Clara looked entirely different, something closer to the near total absence of the fear response itself, at least in these specific circumstances, as though some part of Clara's nervous system had been recalibrated at a fundamental level to simply not register these encounters as the mortal threats they so clearly were to everyone else. Nora had read about extreme cases of this kind of adaptation before, mostly in isolated academic literature about survivors of prolonged extreme stress, individuals whose bodies had, through repeated exposure to genuine life-threatening danger over long periods, developed unusually blunted physiological fear responses as a kind of psychological adaptation. It was a controversial area of research, poorly understood even by specialists, and it typically appeared only in people who had endured years of sustained trauma, often from early childhood, in environments where a heightened, constant fear response would have been unsustainable for long-term survival. The implications of that theory, if it held true for Clara, troubled Nora more than any of the wildlife encounters themselves had. It suggested that whatever gift allowed Clara Winslow to walk unharmed among the most dangerous predators in Silverpine had not come from training, or study, or natural talent developed in comfort and safety. It suggested instead that it had been forged through something far darker, some period of Clara's life defined by prolonged, genuine danger, severe enough to permanently reshape the way her body and mind processed fear itself. Nora approached the subject carefully during their next long conversation, choosing her words with the same caution she might use approaching an unpredictable animal, aware that pushing too hard, too fast, might cause Clara to retreat entirely, the way she had with every other curious colleague before. She asked, gently, whether Clara had experienced something difficult earlier in her life, something that might explain the calm that seemed to define her every interaction with danger. For the first time since Nora had arrived at Silverpine, Clara did not offer an immediate deflection. She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window of the ranger station toward the distant tree line, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight Nora had not heard in it before, a tiredness that suggested this was a story Clara had carried alone for a very long time, one she had never fully told to anyone, not even the people who had come to trust her most. She said there was a story, yes. She said it had happened a long time ago, when she was still a child, and that it explained more than anyone at Silverpine had guessed, though not, she added quietly, in the way most people would expect. She said she had never told the full story to anyone, because she was not certain anyone would believe her, and because remembering it clearly enough to explain it out loud had always felt like reliving something she had spent years trying to leave behind in the mountains where it happened. Nora did not press further that evening. She simply thanked Clara for trusting her enough to say even that much, and left the conversation there, sensing that whatever came next would need to unfold on its own terms, in its own time, rather than being pulled forward by impatient curiosity. But she left the ranger station that night with a growing certainty that the true explanation behind Clara Winslow's extraordinary calm was about to reveal itself, and that it would prove to be a story far more remarkable and far more painful than any single wildlife encounter she had documented so far. The story Clara finally told, weeks later, on a quiet evening, when the two women sat alone by the small wood stove in the ranger station, with nothing but the sound of wind moving through the pines outside, began not in Silverpine, but hundreds of miles to the north, in a stretch of wilderness so remote that even experienced guides rarely traveled through it, without extensive preparation and support. Clara had been 7 years old when her father, a man named Arthur Winslow, decided to take her on what was meant to be a short camping trip along a lake system he had visited many times before as a younger man. Arthur was an experienced outdoorsman, careful and methodical, the kind of father who taught his daughter to read a compass before she learned to ride a bicycle. He had planned the trip carefully, packed appropriately, and told no one exactly how far off the main trail system he intended to travel, a small oversight that would prove almost fatal in the days that followed. On the third day of the trip, a sudden storm rolled in from the mountains faster than either of them had anticipated, and in the chaos of breaking camp quickly to seek shelter, Arthur slipped on wet rock and fell nearly 20 feet down a ravine, breaking his leg badly enough that he could no longer walk. Clara, only 7 years old, found herself suddenly responsible for a man who could not move, in a wilderness, with no trail markers, no cell signal, and no realistic hope of rescue, arriving before their limited supplies ran out. What followed was nearly 3 weeks of survival that Clara described, even all these years later, with a flatness in her voice that Nora recognized immediately as the particular kind of calm that only comes from having processed and repackaged genuine trauma into something bearable enough to speak aloud. She described learning, in those 3 weeks, to move through the forest as quietly as possible, because her father, delirious with pain and fever for much of that time, had warned her again and again about the dangers of drawing predator attention while unable to defend themselves. She described learning to control her breathing, her movements, even her own fear, because she had come to understand, with a clarity far beyond her 7 years, that fear itself seemed to invite danger closer, that animals responded to the frantic, jerking movements of a frightened child in ways they did not respond to stillness and quiet. She described, in particular, one night midway through their ordeal when a wolf, drawn perhaps by the scent of her father's untreated wound, had approached their makeshift shelter in the darkness. Clara, alone and terrified, had done the only thing her 7-year-old mind could think to do. She had gone completely still, had slowed her breathing until it barely moved her chest, had stared not directly into the wolf's eyes but somewhere near its shoulder, the way she had once seen an old nature documentary suggest, and had simply waited, for what felt like hours, until the animal eventually lost interest and moved on. That single night, she told Nora, had changed something fundamental in the way her body processed fear from that point forward. She could not explain it in scientific terms, could not offer the kind of physiological mechanism Nora's academic training craved, but she knew, with absolute certainty, that some part of her mind had made a decision that night that it never fully reversed afterward. Fear, she had learned in the most brutal way possible, was not a tool that helped her survive. Stillness was, calm was, and whatever part of her brain controlled the instinctive fight or flight response had, through the sheer necessity of survival, learned to override its own most basic programming. They were eventually found, 19 days after the fall, by a search party that had expanded its search radius far beyond the initial planned route after Arthur failed to check in with a ranger station he had promised to contact. Clara's father survived, though his leg never fully healed, and he walked with a permanent limp for the rest of his life. Clara herself was treated for dehydration and minor exposure, but physically, remarkably, she had come through the ordeal largely unharmed. The deeper wounds, the ones that mattered most to understanding who she eventually became, were not physical at all. Clara described years of quiet withdrawal afterward, a childhood spent feeling disconnected from other children her age, who seemed to fear things she no longer had the capacity to fear in the same visceral way, small things like thunderstorms, or dark bedrooms that had once frightened her too, before those 19 days had recalibrated her entire relationship with danger itself. She described her father's own struggle in the years that followed, his guilt over what he had put his young daughter through, his own transformation into an overly cautious, anxious man in the years after an accident that had once been the opposite, a complicated inversion of roles that left Clara, in many ways, feeling like the calmer, steadier presence in their household from that point forward. She spent her teenage years increasingly drawn back toward wilderness rather than away from it, a choice that confused and worried the adults around her, who assumed a traumatic experience in the woods should have produced fear of the woods, rather than a deep, almost magnetic pull back toward them. But Clara explained to Nora that the wilderness had never been the thing she feared. The wilderness had, in a strange and complicated way, become the one place where the changes in her own mind made sense, where the calm she carried inside her, the calm that felt so foreign and isolating everywhere else in her life, finally found an environment that seemed to understand and respect it in return. She spent years after leaving home working seasonal jobs in increasingly remote locations, teaching herself wilderness survival skills far beyond what her father had shown her as a child, spending long stretches of time completely alone in various backcountry regions, partly out of genuine interest in the natural world, and partly, she admitted quietly to Nora, because solitude in the wilderness remained the only place she ever felt fully at peace. It was during these years that she began to notice, gradually and almost without realizing it at first, that wild animals seemed to respond to her differently than they responded to other people, that the same stillness and calm that had saved her life at 7 years old seemed to communicate something to predators that her conscious mind could not fully articulate. Some signal of non-threat, non-prey, simply another creature moving through the landscape without the frantic, fear-driven energy that predators had evolved over millions of years to notice and respond to. Nora listened to the entire story without interrupting, and when Clara finally finished, the ranger station had gone almost fully dark around them. The fire in the wood stove burned down to glowing embers, the only light in the room. Nora found herself reaching, instinctively, for the scientific framework that had guided her entire career, trying to fit what she had just heard into established theory, into published research, into something she could footnote and explain with proper academic rigor. But some part of her recognized, even as she made the attempt, that Clara's story resisted that kind of tidy categorization, that it existed in the difficult space between documented psychological adaptation and something more personal, more human, than any research paper could fully capture. What Nora could say, with confidence, based on everything she had observed and everything Clara had now explained, was that the physiological blunting of Clara's fear response was almost certainly real, and almost certainly rooted in the extreme, sustained stress of those 19 days in the wilderness as a child. The scientific literature on early childhood trauma and its effects on the developing nervous system supported the plausibility of exactly this kind of adaptation, even if Clara's case represented an unusually extreme and well-documented example. Children who experienced prolonged, genuine threats to survival at critical developmental ages sometimes did emerge with permanently altered stress responses, sometimes manifesting as heightened anxiety and hypervigilance, but occasionally, in rarer cases, manifesting instead as this kind of profound, almost unnatural calm in the face of danger that would overwhelm most adults. What Nora could not fully explain, even with all her expertise, was how precisely that internal calm translated into the specific behavioral changes she had observed in predator after predator throughout her weeks at Silverpine. She theorized, based on her broader research into animal behavior, that predators relied heavily on subtle physiological cues, changes in scent linked to stress hormones, changes in heart rate and breathing pattern, changes in the small, often unconscious movements of a frightened body, to assess whether a potential threat or prey animal was dangerous, vulnerable, or simply irrelevant to their immediate survival needs. If Clara's body genuinely did not produce the same stress signals that predators had evolved to read as warning signs, it stood to reason that animals encountering her would receive a fundamentally different set of signals than they received from virtually every other human being who crossed their path. Signals that did not trigger the typical predatory calculus of threat assessment, prey evaluation, or territorial challenge. It was not magic, Nora concluded, though she understood entirely why the people of Ashwood Hollow had begun to speak of Clara in almost mythical terms. It was something more remarkable in its own way, a testament to the strange, sometimes devastating, sometimes unexpectedly protective ways the human mind adapts to survive experiences it was never meant to endure, and to the fact that even the deepest wounds sometimes reshape a person into something capable of extraordinary things, things that looked, from the outside, indistinguishable from a kind of quiet, unshakable grace. Clara asked Nora, near the end of that long night, not to publish anything about her personal history without permission, and Nora agreed immediately, understanding that whatever professional interest she felt in documenting this case, took a distant second place to respecting the trust Clara had extended in sharing something so deeply personal. But she did ask, gently, whether Clara would be willing to let her document the broader pattern of her wildlife encounters, in the hope that whatever insight could be drawn from her experience might eventually help other researchers, other rangers, other people who found themselves face to face with dangerous predators and needed every possible advantage to survive the encounter. Clara agreed, though she made clear that she did not think of herself as someone with answers to offer. She said she had simply survived something terrible as a child, and had spent the rest of her life trying to make sense of what that survival had cost her, and what, unexpectedly, it had also given her in return. It was not a gift she would have chosen, she said quietly, staring into the dying embers of the fire, but it was the one she had been given, and she had long ago decided that the only meaningful response to an experience like that was to use whatever it had left behind in service of something worthwhile, rather than letting it remain simply a wound she carried alone. The test of everything Clara Winslow had learned, and everything Nora Fitzgerald had spent months documenting, arrived on a cold October afternoon that none of the Silver Pine staff would ever forget, in a moment that turned quiet local legend into something the entire region would speak about for years afterward. A group of 11 school children, on a supervised field trip to study the reserve's autumn wildlife migration, had wandered further from their designated viewing platform than their 2 accompanying teachers realized, drawn by the excitement of spotting a herd of elk moving through a distant meadow. By the time the teachers, a young woman named Margaret Hollis and an older man named Edward Whitmore, realized how far the group had strayed, the children had descended into a narrow valley, thick with willow and alder, precisely the kind of terrain where visibility dropped to almost nothing, and where, unknown to any of them, a male grizzly bear had been feeding on the last of the season's berry crop only a few hundred yards away. The first anyone at the ranger station learned of the danger was a frantic radio call from Margaret Hollis, her voice cracking with barely controlled panic as she reported that the bear had emerged from the brush directly between the children and their only clear path back toward the viewing platform, and that the animal, agitated by the sudden noise and movement of 11 excited, frightened children, had begun huffing and stamping the ground in unmistakable warning. Clara was nearly 2 miles away when the call came through, conducting a routine survey along the western ridge, but she was, by sheer chance, the closest reserve staff member to the valley where the children were trapped. Henry Doyle, coordinating the response from the station, made the call to send her ahead, while a full emergency team scrambled to follow, a decision that would later draw scrutiny from reserve officials concerned about protocol, but one that Henry never once regretted, not after everything he had witnessed over the preceding months. Clara covered the distance in a little over 11 minutes, moving through terrain that would have taken most people twice as long, guided by nothing but the increasingly panicked radio updates from Margaret Hollis and her own intimate knowledge of the valley's layout. When she finally arrived at the scene, she found exactly the situation she had feared during that desperate run through the forest. 11 children, ranging in age from perhaps 9 to 12, huddled together against a rock face with their 2 visibly terrified teachers, and less than 40 feet away, a grizzly bear well over 600 pounds, agitated, cornered by the narrowing terrain on one side and the frightened group on the other, showing every sign of an animal building toward a defensive charge. What happened next would be described, in the following weeks, by nearly every witness present, in remarkably consistent detail, despite the chaos and terror of the moment. A consistency that Nora Fitzgerald would later note made for an unusually reliable piece of testimony in an incident that might otherwise have sounded too extraordinary to believe. Clara did not rush toward the children. She did not shout or wave her arms in the way instinct might suggest, a mistake that could easily have provoked the exact charge everyone feared. Instead, she moved into the open space between the bear and the group, with slow, deliberate steps, her body angled sideways in the same posture Daniel Marsh and Henry Doyle had both described from their own earlier encounters, making herself visible to the bear as a calm, unhurried presence, rather than another frantic, threatening element, added to an already volatile situation. She began speaking, not to the children, but to the bear itself, in that same low, even murmur that seemed to carry no trace of the fear that would have been entirely justified in that moment. Margaret Hollis later said she would never forget the strange, almost dreamlike quality of watching a grown woman speak calmly to an enraged grizzly bear, as though negotiating with an old and difficult friend, and how, against every instinct screaming in her own mind that this could only end in tragedy, something in Clara's stillness made her believe, however briefly, however impossibly, that it might not. The bear's agitation did not vanish immediately. It huffed twice more, stamped the ground hard enough that several of the younger children began crying, and took 2 full steps forward, close enough now that Clara stood well within the distance most wildlife safety training identified as almost certainly fatal range for a charging grizzly. Behind her, she could hear Edward Whitmore's voice, low and urgent, trying to keep the children calm and still, and she knew, without needing to look, that every second that passed without the bear either charging or retreating was a second in which the situation could tip irreversibly in either direction. She lowered herself slowly to one knee, reducing her height further, continuing the same steady murmur, and extended one open hand, not toward the bear, but simply outward, palm up, in a gesture that offered nothing and threatened nothing at all. The bear's massive head swung toward her, nostrils working rapidly, its small eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that Margaret Hollis described as the most frightening thing she had ever witnessed in her life, and for what felt to every person present like an unbearably long stretch of time. Though later footage from a teacher's phone confirmed it lasted just under 30 seconds, the animal simply stood there, weight rocking slightly from paw to paw, caught in the same moment of decision that Clara had learned, so many years earlier, and so many miles from this exact spot, to recognize and to meet without flinching. And then, as it had every time before, the moment broke in Clara's favor. The bear's stance shifted, its head lowered, its weight settled back fully onto all 4 paws, and with one final, resonant huff that seemed to carry something close to reluctant acceptance, it turned and moved back into the willow thicket from which it had emerged, disappearing from sight within seconds, leaving behind 11 children, 2 shaken teachers, and 1 woman who remained kneeling, in the sudden, overwhelming silence for several long moments, before finally rising and turning to check on the group she had just saved. The emergency response team arrived less than 10 minutes later to find the entire group safely gathered, shaken but unharmed, walking calmly back toward the main trail under Clara's steady guidance. News of the incident spread through Ashwood Hollow within hours, and within days, it had reached well beyond the small community, drawing attention from regional news outlets curious about the ranger who had apparently talked down a charging grizzly bear to save a group of terrified schoolchildren. Clara found the sudden attention deeply uncomfortable, declining most interview requests and insisting, whenever she did speak publicly, that she had simply done what any trained ranger should have done in that situation, a modest framing that Henry Doyle, Daniel Marsh, and everyone else who had witnessed her earlier encounters found almost impossible to reconcile with everything they had seen over the preceding months. What she had done was not simply training, it was something far rarer, something built from a childhood tragedy she had spent years trying to understand, and finally, in that valley, transformed into an act that had likely saved 11 young lives. In the months that followed, Nora Fitzgerald completed her research at Silverpine and returned to academic life carrying with her a body of documented case studies that would go on to influence wildlife safety training programs across several reserves in the following years. Though she honored her promise to Clara and kept the deeper personal history behind her calm private, referencing it only in the broadest possible terms, as an example of trauma-informed adaptation, without ever revealing the specific details of those 19 days that had reshaped a 7-year-old girl's relationship with fear forever. Clara herself remained at Silverpine, continuing her work much as she always had, though the incident with the school children had, whether she wanted it or not, cemented her reputation as something far beyond an ordinary reserve ranger. Young rangers arriving at Silverpine in the years that followed often asked to shadow her during fieldwork, hoping to learn even a fraction of whatever it was that allowed her to move through dangerous terrain with a calm none of their formal training had ever managed to instill in them. Clara taught what she could, patiently, though she was always careful to remind them that what she carried had not come cheaply, and that she would not wish the particular path that had shaped her onto anyone, however useful its unexpected result had turned out to be. Henry Doyle, nearing retirement in the years that followed, often told newer staff that the true lesson of Clara Winslow's story was not that fear could simply be willed away through determination or bravery, but that the human capacity for adaptation, even in the face of the most difficult and painful experiences imaginable, sometimes produced something unexpectedly valuable on the other side, something that could not have been taught, only survived into existence. He would remind them that Clara had never sought out the reputation that eventually surrounded her, had never asked to become a legend among the wolves and bears and mountain lions of Silverpine, and that perhaps the truest measure of her character was not the extraordinary calm she carried into every dangerous encounter, but the quiet humility with which she continued to show up, day after day, for a wilderness that had once nearly taken everything from her, and had somehow, against every expectation, given something remarkable back in return. Clara Winslow never carried a weapon into the wilderness of Silverpine. She never needed one. What she carried instead, forged in the desperate silence of a childhood ordeal no 7-year-old should ever have had to endure, proved to be something no rifle or blade could ever replicate. A stillness so complete, so genuine, that even the fiercest predators of the northern wilderness recognized it instantly for exactly what it was. Not weakness, not fear, but something far older and far more powerful than either, the simple, unshakable presence of a creature that had already faced the worst the wild had to offer, and had chosen, against every reasonable expectation, to walk back into it anyway.